They burned rival clubhouses to earn their patches. They murdered a young mother to protect their name. They drove a tent stake through a former brother's skull. 3 years in, every one of them was in federal custody. This is how it ended. The Mongols nation, and what it took to join it. Before there was a Clarksville chapter, before there was a Tennessee territory, before the first burn and the first murder and the first federal indictment, there was the Mongols Motorcycle Club, an organization that the Department of Justice had been trying to dismantle in one form or another since the 1970s, and that in 2015 had chapters in 28 countries and every major region of the continental United States except one. Tennessee was open territory. The Mongols were founded in Montebello, California in 1969 by a group of Hispanic veterans who had been turned away from the Hells Angels, a club that, in the late 1960s, was not accepting Latin members regardless of other qualifications. The men who founded the Mongols were not deterred by rejection. They built something that, over the following 5 decades, would grow into one of the most documented and most prosecuted criminal motorcycle organizations in the world. Their motto, "Respect few, fear none," was not aspirational, it was operational. Their fight song described castrating enemies with a dirty piece of glass. Their patches told a story that the men wearing them wanted to be read clearly. They were the 1%, the outlaws, the men who lived outside every law that claimed authority over them and answered to nothing except the code the club had written for itself. The Mongols' organizational structure was built with a corporate precision that belied the outlaw mythology. At the top sat the mother chapter in Southern California, which held authority over every chapter in the nation, reviewing membership applications, handling disputes between chapters, collecting dues, taxes, and fees that flowed upward from every chapter in the network. Below the mother chapter, each local chapter maintained its own officer structure, a president, vice president, secretary-treasurer, and sergeant-at-arms, the last of whom was responsible for discipline and the enforcement of club rules through whatever means the situation required. Entry into the organization was structured and deliberate. Men who wanted to become Mongols first hung around without status, watching and being watched. If they passed that evaluation, they became prospects, marked with a P patch on their vest, visible to everyone in the outlaw world as men in the probationary state that full membership required. Prospects spent a minimum of a year proving themselves before a vote on their full membership was held. And before any of this, before hang-around status was even extended, prospective members and their wives and girlfriends submitted personal information and vehicle details to the mother chapter for background checks. This was not a loose affiliation of men who liked motorcycles. It was a structured organization with written commandments, a constitution, bylaws, a formal hierarchy, and punishment mechanisms for violations of the code. When a member was disciplined, the club could center punch him, remove the central Genghis Khan patch from his vest, and leave only the rockers, a visible humiliation that the entire outlaw world could read. When a member earned distinction, they received patches that documented what they had done. Respect few, fear none, patches awarded for violence, committed on behalf of the club, founding member patches, patches commemorating fallen brothers, patches marking specific runs attended. The vest told the story. The story was always the same: what you had done for the organization, what the organization had given you, and what would happen to anyone who threatened either. In 2015, the Mongols did not have a chapter in Tennessee. That was the opportunity, and the men who saw it were willing to do whatever the organization required to take advantage of it. What the Mongols' organizational model produced over 5 decades of institutional development was something that law enforcement agencies consistently underestimated in its sophistication and consistently overestimated in its central coordination. The club was not a cartel. It did not have a command structure that issued specific operational orders to chapters across the country. What it had was a culture, a code, and a hierarchy that set the parameters within which each chapter operated, and that made the conduct of individual chapters legible as organizational conduct rather than individual criminal behavior. That distinction mattered enormously for federal prosecution. It was the difference between charging individuals with crimes and charging an enterprise with racketeering. The RICO framework that federal prosecutors used against the Clarksville Mongols in 2017 and 2018 was the same framework the government had been developing against outlaw motorcycle clubs for decades, a framework built on the understanding that what made organizations like the Mongols dangerous was not any specific crime committed by any specific member, but the pattern of criminal activity that the organizational culture produced and the institutional structure that supported, rewarded, and concealed it. Every chapter that paid dues to the mother chapter, every member who received a patch for committing violence, every sergeant-at-arms who administered discipline through beatings, was participating in an enterprise whose pattern had to be established before any individual member could be convicted of racketeering, rather than simply of the underlying criminal offense. The Clarksville chapter, in 3 years of existence, generated more evidence of that pattern than most chapters produce in decades. The weekly misses were documented, the dues payments were documented, the officer structure was documented, the patch ceremonies for violence were documented, the drug distribution operation was documented through financial records, informant testimony, and the $44,000 seized from Thomas Chavez's rental car. The murders were documented through the bodies that investigators eventually found, the forensic evidence at the scenes, and the testimony of men who had been present and who eventually made the calculation that cooperation with federal prosecutors was a better outcome than the sentences they would face if they didn't. The Clarksville chapter, in its ambition and its violence and its organizational dysfunction, had produced a federal case that essentially built itself. The men who wanted in. The story of the Clarksville Mongols began not with the club itself, but with a man named Alex Santiago and a dissatisfaction that was both personal and organizational. Santiago was connected to the Sin City Disciples, a 1% motorcycle club that operated in the Clarksville area and that differed from the Mongols in one fundamental way. Sin City accepted members of all races. The Mongols were described as an all-male club composed of white and Hispanic members. The racial composition was not incidental. It was part of the organizational identity, the specific kind of fraternity the club had built, the specific kind of man it recruited, and the specific kind of loyalty it expected. Santiago wanted to leave Sin City. More than that, he wanted to bring the Mongols into Tennessee, to be the man who planted the flag in territory the club had never held. He began assembling a group in early 2015, James Wesley Frazier, Jamie Hearn, Michael Forrester, Jacob Ort, and eventually others who would grow the chapter from a handful of aspirants into an organization that the Department of Justice would describe as one of the worst violent criminal enterprises Middle Tennessee had ever seen. But wanting to be Mongols and becoming Mongols were two entirely different things. The club's chapter formation process was rigorous and could not be circumvented by ambition alone. The Clarksville group needed a sponsor, a full-patch Mongol, who would vouch for them, guide them through the process, and stand behind them before the mother chapter. That sponsor came in the form of Tupelo Luatis, a full-patch Mongol from the Harbor chapter in Southern California, whose family lived in the Clarksville area. He agreed to serve as their patch daddy, to guide the aspiring Tennessee chapter through the organization's formal processes. A second Harbor chapter member, Thomas Chavez, would eventually become far more significant than his initial role suggested. Chavez became the group's primary methamphetamine supplier, the man who transformed what might have been a small regional drug operation into a $1 million distribution network that pumped 50 pounds of nearly pure California methamphetamine into Tennessee and Kentucky. The aspiring chapter held their first documented meeting around Memorial Day weekend 2015 at a barbecue hosted by Tupelo's wife. Future members gathered. Their photographs were taken. Their social security numbers were written down and sent to the mother chapter for processing. One man was so energized by the prospect of joining that the following morning he went to Appleton Harley-Davidson and traded in his sport bike for an American-made motorcycle, because if he was going to be a Mongol, he needed to ride what Mongols rode. What distinguished the early Clarksville group from other aspiring chapters was not their sophistication, it was their willingness to move quickly. They began holding weekly missars within weeks of the Memorial Day meeting. They were already selling drugs before they had official status, and they had already decided, clearly and without much internal debate, that the way to prove their value to the Mongols nation was to demonstrate that they were willing to commit violence without hesitation and without restriction. That decision was the foundation everything that followed was built on, and it was also the reason every one of them ended in a federal courtroom. Earning the patch, fire, and a drive-by. The principle was simple and consistent with everything the Mongols' organizational culture demanded. You had to show what you were willing to do. Words and dues and meetings were necessary, but not sufficient. The chapter formation process required proof of commitment, and in the outlaw motorcycle world, proof of commitment looked like willingness to commit violence on behalf of the organization. The Clarksville aspirants understood this. Their early acts of violence were not the chaotic crimes of disorganized criminals. They were auditions, carefully sequenced demonstrations designed to communicate to the mother chapter that the Tennessee group was serious, capable, and prepared to do whatever the organization required. In March and April 2015, before the group had formal status, messages on Alex Santiago's phone documented that the Clarksville Mongols had already started putting in work the specific language of an organization that expects its prospects to demonstrate value through action before asking for the benefits that action is supposed to earn. On the 13th of May, 2015, Frazier, Santiago, and Jacob Ort conducted a drive-by shooting at the home of Brian Waters, a member of the Outcast Motorcycle Club, a rival club operating in the Clarksville area. The shooting was a message to the Outcast Club about the new organization that was establishing itself in Clarksville's criminal landscape. It was also a message to the California Mongols about what the Tennessee group was prepared to do. The 15th of May, 2015, Alex Santiago burned down the Sin City Disciples Clubhouse in Nashville, the club he was leaving, the club that had given him his first introduction to the outlaw world. He burned it to the ground as an act of severance, a statement delivered in the most permanent possible terms about where his loyalties now lay and what his departure from Sin City meant for Sin City's continued presence in the markets the Mongols intended to take for themselves. 2 days later, on May 17th, Frazier and Jacob Ort burned down the Sin City Clubhouse in Clarksville. 2 cities, 2 buildings, coordinated arson against an organization whose only offense was being the club that Santiago and Frazier were defecting from. After the Clarksville fire, Santiago sent a text to Tupelo. "We protected your family. Remember that." The message was a reminder that Tupelo's family was in Clarksville, that the Sin City Disciples had been operating in that geography, and that by eliminating Sin City, the Clarksville group had removed a potential threat that anyone connected to the area needed to take seriously. They expected credit. They expected the California chapter to understand that what had been done for organizational reasons, and that the organizational reward, the chapter recognition they were working toward, was now more justified than it had been before the fires were lit. What the early violence established was a pattern that the chapter would follow until its destruction. Every conflict was resolved through force or the threat of it. Every challenge to the chapter's authority was answered with something visible, something that communicated unmistakably what the consequences of resistance were. The fires that announced the chapter's arrival in Clarksville were the template for everything that followed. The murder of Stephanie Bradley. The 22nd of May 2015, less than 10 days after the drive-by at Brian Waters' house, less than a week after the 2 clubhouse fires. The Clarksville Mongols had been operating as an organized group for barely 2 months when they committed the act that would eventually anchor the RICO case against them, the kidnapping and murder of Stephanie Bradley, a young mother whom they believed had stolen drugs, money, or guns from the organization, or at minimum knew who had. Stephanie Bradley was not a Mongols member. She was not a rival. She was a woman who had, in the group's assessment, stolen from them or knew someone who had, and who had compounded that offense by talking about it, posting on Facebook about being harassed and threatened by motorcycle guys. In the world the Clarksville Mongols were building, that combination suspected theft and public speech about the club was a capital offense, not metaphorically, literally. The sequence of events that preceded her death was documented in federal court testimony with a specificity that left nothing ambiguous about the premeditation involved. Frazier and Jacob Ort brought Stephanie and a woman named Misty Wallace to a house on Green Valley Court where the group had been staying and questioned them in a bedroom about the alleged theft. Joel Aldridge, a man Frazier would later describe as a sociopathic murderer, a man who had a documented reputation for violence that the Clarksville group found useful and eventually lethal, was called up from the basement where he had been living. His presence alone was enough to reduce both women to tears. They were eventually released, with explicit instructions: say nothing about this, say nothing about the Clarksville Mongols, and understand what saying something would cost. Stephanie didn't stay silent. She went on Facebook. She posted about being harassed by motorcycle guys. Whether she named the Mongols directly, or whether she said enough that Frazier and Ort recognized themselves in the description, is a question the record doesn't answer definitively. What the record answers clearly is what happened next. She came back to Green Valley Court looking for drugs, which gave Frazier and Ort a second opportunity to confront her. This interrogation was worse. All three men, Frazier, Ort, and Aldridge, were armed when they questioned her again. She was released again, warned again. The warning was more explicit this time: stop talking or get hurt. She kept posting. On the evening of the 22nd of May, 2015, Frazier, Ort, and Aldridge loaded into the black Dodge Durango that Aldridge had taken from another man as payment on a drug debt and went looking for Stephanie Bradley. They found her at a trailer off Lafayette Road in Clarksville. Joel Aldridge went inside, grabbed her, and brought her out. She was crying and so terrified that she wet herself. Aldridge laughed at her. They forced her into the Durango. Then they went to collect Brandy Cooper, a woman who had introduced them to Stephanie, pulling her into the vehicle on the pretext that Joel was bringing her drugs. Brandy climbed in willingly. She had no idea what she was climbing into. Frazier drove into the countryside. Jacob Ort took the ammunition from his weapon, wiped down each bullet to remove fingerprints, reloaded the gun, and put the barrel in Stephanie Bradley's mouth. She was sobbing. She begged. She told them they could hurt her if they wanted, as long as they let her live. They drove to Kings Branch Cemetery in Bumpus Mills, Tennessee, a specific destination, chosen in advance, in a location remote enough that what happened next wouldn't be heard. Brandy Cooper was left in the Durango under guard. Stephanie Bradley was walked into the woods behind the cemetery. Jacob Ort shot her approximately 8 times. Then Frazier told Joel Aldridge to shoot her in the head to make certain she was dead. He did. Her body was left at the base of a creek bed in the hope that no one would find it. No one did for nearly 15 months. In August 2016, police received a tip about where to look. Investigators went to the cemetery and found what remained: skeletal remains, decomposed nearly beyond identification, in the woods behind a cemetery in rural Tennessee. The ATF and federal prosecutors had the case they needed. It would take another 18 months to build the full indictment, but the foundation was a young mother's bones in the woods at a place the men who put her there had chosen because they thought no one would ever look. The specific detail that makes the murder of Stephanie Bradley most revealing about the Clarksville Mongols is not the murder itself. Outlaw motorcycle clubs have committed murders throughout their documented history, and the murder of a perceived informant or a person believed to have stolen from the organization is, within the framework of outlaw motorcycle club violence, not unprecedented. What is revealing is the trigger. Stephanie Bradley was not a rival. She was not an informant who had gone to law enforcement. She had not testified against any member. She had posted on Facebook. She had told friends that motorcycle guys had harassed her. And for the specific violation of the code that demanded silence from everyone who encountered the club, regardless of whether they were members or outsiders, she was kidnapped, driven to a rural cemetery, walked into the woods, and shot to death. The organizational logic that produced that outcome was the same logic that made the chapter's entire operation possible: the belief that the club's authority extended to everyone within its orbit, that the rules it operated by applied to members and non-members alike, and that violations of those rules carried consequences regardless of who committed them. Stephanie Bradley was not a Mongol. She had no obligation to the Clarksville chapter and no understanding of the code that governed it. She was a woman who had been threatened by men who scared her and who had told people about it in the most natural way available to her. She died for it. The 15 months between her murder and the discovery of her remains at Kings Branch Cemetery in Bumpus Mills, Tennessee, were 15 months during which her family lived with an absence they could not explain. 15 months during which the men who had killed her continued operating the chapter, receiving patches, attending runs, holding missas, selling methamphetamine, and conducting themselves as if the cemetery in the countryside where they had left a young mother's body was simply part of the geography of their territory. When the tip came in August 2016, and investigators went to the cemetery and found what was left of her, the skeletal remains had been there long enough that the specific cause of death required forensic reconstruction rather than direct observation. The Clarksville chapter had buried one of its victims. They had hidden the other, Stephen Cole, in a shallow hole behind an abandoned house. Neither hiding place was adequate. Both bodies were eventually found. The investigation that found them was the investigation that ended the chapter. What the chapter had done to two people in the woods and in a Kentucky shed was what the federal government brought to a jury in a 3.5-month trial that ended with 6 convictions and sentences that ranged to life plus 30 years, building the drug empire. The violence was never only about violence. From the beginning, the Clarksville chapter's organizational purpose, the reason the Mongols' mother chapter had any interest in a Tennessee presence at all, was economic. Tennessee's methamphetamine market was wide open in 2015. The state had significant demand and relatively limited organized supply compared to the markets the Mongols had already saturated in California and the Southwest. Opening a chapter in Clarksville was not simply an expansion of the club's geographic footprint, it was the opening of a revenue stream. Thomas Chavez, the harbor chapter member who had initially been part of the sponsorship arrangement, assumed the central role in the drug operation. By September 2015, he became the supplier. What had begun as small deals, ounces, occasional transactions transformed under Chavez's involvement into a structured distribution operation. Quarter-pound deals, half-pound deals, eventually full-pound transactions, with the Clarksville chapter paying approximately $10,000 per pound for methamphetamine of nearly 100% purity and selling it in Tennessee and Kentucky for as much as $20,000 per pound, a margin that made the operation profitable enough to fund everything else the chapter was doing. Frazier and Santiago oversaw the operation at the chapter level. Santiago was described as the money man, the financial manager who handled proceeds and served as Chavez's primary point of contact in Tennessee. Associates helped facilitate the deals. Kyle Heddy and his girlfriend Teresa Cobb served as intermediaries for some transactions, handling prescription pills alongside the primary methamphetamine business. The distribution network extended through multiple counties in Tennessee and into Kentucky, moving product through a retail network that a chapter-level operation with consistent supply could sustain. Frazier explicitly understood the drug business as organizational currency. He told associates that he was traveling to California and paying Chavez above-market prices for methamphetamine specifically because the commercial relationship helped establish the Clarksville chapter's value to the mother chapter. Money was not just revenue. Every pound purchased, every payment delivered, every drug run completed and accounted for was evidence that the Clarksville Mongols were worth the patches the mother chapter had the authority to grant. The estimated total value of the methamphetamine the Clarksville chapter moved was approximately $1 million more than 50 pounds of nearly 100% pure product, transported from California to Tennessee across multiple trips, distributed through a network that touched multiple counties in 2 states. It was a significant regional drug operation, and it was running in parallel with the chapter's ongoing violence, the two enterprises serving each other's purposes in ways that the RICO framework would eventually use to describe them as a single criminal enterprise rather than separate criminal activities that happened to share organizational membership. The 14th of December, 2015, Thomas Chavez was stopped for tailgating a tractor-trailer in Dixon County. The search of his rental car found $44,000 in cash and Mongols gear. He was arrested. In a single traffic stop, the operation had lost its supplier and its patch daddy. The chapter scrambled to replace both. They never fully succeeded at either. The shooting at Bojangles and the chaos that followed. The 15th of January, 2016, evening in Clarksville, a drug deal that had been arranged at a Bojangles restaurant on Tiny Town Road ended in gunfire that illustrated precisely the kind of organizational instability that the chapter was generating through its own conduct. Teresa Cobb regularly bought pills from Timothy Grant, a man with no Mongols affiliation, in small quantities. On this particular night, she wanted $5,000 worth of Apana 40 a prescription opioid that moved well in the local market. Grant and his associate, Dustin McCracken, decided, rather than complete the sale, to rob her. The meeting was set at the Bojangles parking lot. Teresa arrived in a black Dodge Charger driven by Kyle Heddy. Timothy and McCracken pulled up in a red Volkswagen Jetta. Teresa got into the back seat of the Jetta. The cash was checked with a marker. Then, Dustin McCracken tried to snatch the money. Teresa screamed. Kyle Heddy, outside in the Charger, heard her. He jumped out of the vehicle and opened fire into the Jetta 4 or 5 shots. The Jetta sped off and struck a parked car. Timothy Grant, hit 3 times in the back and once in the head, was transported first to Clarksville's local hospital and then airlifted to Vanderbilt University Trauma Center with injuries so severe that his survival was not certain. What happened inside the chapter after the shooting illustrated the operational dysfunction that had been developing since Thomas Chavez's arrest. Frazier sent a group message, "Link up at Teresa's house." When police arrived at Teresa Cobb's residence on Meredith Way, they found Frazier opening the door and Santiago inside, wearing latex gloves on both hands, actively cleaning the weapon used in the shooting. Officers observed 2 blunts sitting on a desk visible from the doorway. When they asked about drugs and Frazier tried to push them out, officers detained both men. A protective sweep found the black Dodge Charger in the garage. A search produced guns, drugs, scales, drug paraphernalia, and $41,940 in cash. Both men were arrested. Kyle Heddy, separately detained, cooperated immediately, telling investigators how the drug operation worked, where money was kept, and who had provided him with the gun used in the Bojangles shooting. From jail, Santiago called Jamie Hearn and told him that he believed Levi West had stolen the $41,940 from the house after the police search. The money, he explained, was supposed to go to Thomas Chavez's harbor chapter to cover drug debts. Hearn passed the information along. James Hines and Stephen Cole went to Callie DiCarlo's apartment, where West was staying. They pulled out weapons. Levi was searched, forced onto the couch, had a gun pressed to his chest, while Jamie Hearn threatened to kill everyone present if they were lying about the money. 2 days later, Levi West was summoned to Hines's apartment and interrogated at gunpoint a second time. The $41,940 was sitting in a police evidence locker the entire time. The men who had terrorized Levi West over its disappearance were terrorizing him over money that law enforcement had seized during the Meredith Way arrest. They never considered that possibility. The operational reasoning of an organization that had been running on violence and fear for barely a year had stopped functioning clearly. They were threatening their own associates over evidence. The chapter was turning on itself. The dysfunction that the Bojangles shooting and its aftermath revealed was not incidental to the Clarksville chapter's operations. It was endemic. The chapter had built itself on violence as the primary tool for resolving every problem: territorial, financial, organizational, personal. The Bojangles shooting was Kyle Heddy responding to Teresa Cobb's scream by firing into a car in a restaurant parking lot. The aftermath was the chapter immediately turning its internal paranoia onto its own members, threatening Levi West over money that the police had already seized, and then arresting both of its senior leaders in a search that found $41,940 in cash, multiple firearms, drugs, and scales in a single residence. From jail, the chapter continued trying to function. Santiago managed communications from custody. Frazier attempted to coordinate drug operations through intermediaries. When they were eventually bailed out with help from Thomas Chavez, they immediately traveled to California, purchased 5 pounds of methamphetamine, brought it back to Tennessee, and sold it within 2 weeks. The organizational resilience was genuine, even as the organizational competence was deteriorating. These were men who genuinely believed in the project, who were willing to continue it despite arrests and the mounting evidence that federal attention was building around them, and who lacked the judgment to recognize that their willingness was itself evidence of the same recklessness that made them useful to prosecutors. The investigation into the Clarksville Mongols was conducted by the ATF, the Clarksville Police Department, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the Kentucky State Police, and multiple county-level law enforcement agencies. It ran from 2015 through 2018, 3 years of evidence collection, informant development, and investigative coordination across state lines that eventually produced a 62-count indictment and a 3.5-month trial. The men who built the chapter to demonstrate that Tennessee was worth the Mongols' investment had instead demonstrated comprehensively and in documented detail exactly why it wasn't. Official recognition and the beginning of the end. July 2016, Palm Springs, California, the Mongols' National Convention. The Clarksville chapter, despite everything, despite Chavez's arrest, despite the Bojangles shooting, despite the operational chaos that had followed, was still standing. On the 10th of July 2016, Mongols Nation officially recognized the Clarksville chapter as a probationary chapter. The men received their vests, they received their patches, they were Mongols. Not full chapter status yet, the P-patch still marked their probationary standing, but they had the colors. The thing that had been the entire point since May 2015, when Santiago burned the Sin City clubhouse and sent Tupelo the text about protecting his family, was finally in their hands. They wore it in July 2016, and the following month flew back to Tennessee to resume the activities that would eventually put every single one of them in a federal cell. The first officers were James Hines as president, Stephen Cole as vice president, Adam Wojciechowski as sergeant-at-arms, and Levi West as treasurer. The leadership structure would rotate constantly in the months that followed, Frazier, Santiago, Meyerholtz, and Hines all serving as president at different points. Officers moving in and out of their positions as internal conflicts displaced them. The instability was both a symptom and a cause. An organization with stable leadership makes better decisions. An organization whose leadership is constantly in flux generates the kind of internal grievances, slights, debts, disrespects, perceived weaknesses that require violent resolution. Every change in the officer roster created new resentments. Every resentment in the Clarksville chapter eventually produced violence. 3 days after the Palm Springs recognition, 6 members of the new probationary chapter were in a brawl with the Diablos Motorcycle Club at Wise Guy's Bar, a fight that began when Santiago told a Diablos member to remove his 1% diamond patch and ended when a Diablos member in a wheelchair pulled a gun and fired it. The men who participated in the fight received respect few, fear none, patches at the next chapter meeting. Organizational rewards for organizational violence. The feedback loop was built into the structure itself. The following day, Robert Homerson followed an Iron Order officer home and shot him 6 times. Chapter members helped treat his wounds and dispose of the weapon. When police came to the house, Jamie Hearn lied to their faces. The chapter had now, in the space of 2 days of having received official recognition, committed armed assault against a rival club and obstructed a police investigation into a shooting. The probationary period was supposed to be the chapter's time to demonstrate that it was ready for full membership. What it demonstrated instead was that no level of organizational maturity had been achieved and none was likely. The chapter that had received its patches on July 10th was already collapsing under the weight of its own conduct before the month was finished. The death of Thomas Chavez. The 23rd of October 2016, Thomas Chavez, the Harbor Chapter Mongol, who had been the Clarksville chapter's primary methamphetamine supplier and the most important link between the Tennessee group and the California Mother Organization, came back to Clarksville with John Alvarez, another Harbor Chapter member. He had been bailed out of the Dixon County arrest. He was back in Tennessee for a night of bar hopping that ended with him and a woman named Sharon Priest at the Riverview Inn. Sometime after that evening, Thomas Chavez overdosed. He died. For the Clarksville chapter, the consequences of their sponsor and supplier dying in their city, on their watch, with a woman they didn't fully trust as the last person to see him alive, were immediate and catastrophic. The California Mongols wanted answers. Some of them blamed the Clarksville chapter for allowing it to happen. The investigation that followed from the Harbor chapter, conducted by men who expected compliance and who had no patience for evasion, put the chapter under the most intense internal scrutiny it had faced. Sharon Priest, who had been with Chavez at the motel, gave conflicting accounts of the evening and stopped answering calls and texts from chapter members. To the Clarksville Mongols, her inconsistency meant guilt. She had either robbed Chavez, drugged him, or knew what had happened and was hiding it. By the time she fled to Nashville, the chapter had already decided she needed to be found. Jamie Hearn tracked her to a Nashville motel through persuasion. She agreed to meet him, believing she was going to talk her way through the situation. She got into a Dodge Magnum station wagon that Hearn was driving. She didn't know that Alex Santiago was in the back seat, hiding under a blanket. The moment the car door closed, Santiago emerged from under the blanket. He wrapped a belt around Sharon Priest's neck and began strangling her. Hearn kept driving from Nashville to Levi West's house in Oak Grove, Kentucky, while Santiago kept the belt in place. At the Kentucky house, Santiago forced Priest into the kitchen with the belt still around her neck, struck her across the legs repeatedly, and dragged her into a bathroom. Other chapter members were summoned. The California Mongols were contacted and kept informed of what was happening and what Sharon was saying. She was held for several days while the Harbor chapter conducted its own investigation and deliberated on what to do with her. Sharon Priest survived because she had personal relationships with enough of the Clarksville members to make her killing politically complicated, and because the California Mongols eventually concluded that she was telling the truth about not knowing what had happened to Thomas Chavez, she was released. Thomas Chavez had died of a drug overdose. His death was not her fault, but she had spent days in captivity, strangled in the back seat of a car, beaten in a kitchen in Kentucky, held hostage while men deciding whether she would live or die discussed the matter with a California chapter 1,700 miles away. The kidnapping and imprisonment of Sharon Priest illustrated something specific about the Clarksville chapter that the months of drug trafficking and shooting and arson had not fully captured. The chapter's response to uncertainty was always the same. It didn't investigate. It didn't deliberate. It reached for violence and held on until the violence produced either an answer or a decision about what to do with the person it was applied to. Sharon Priest didn't know what had happened to Thomas Chavez. She said so, repeatedly, during the days she was held. The chapter's response to that answer was to hold her longer, question her more violently, and wait for the California Mongols to make a determination about her fate. The California Mongols took several days to reach their conclusion. During those days, Sharon Priest was held in Kentucky, a belt around her neck, in a house belonging to a man whose role in the organization was specifically to handle this kind of situation. The sergeant-at-arms enforces club rules. Thomas Chavez's death was a club crisis. The response was entirely within the organizational framework. It was just that the framework, in this case, was holding an innocent woman hostage while an outlaw motorcycle club from California decided whether she would live or die. She did live, but her survival was not the result of any recognition by the chapter that what they were doing was wrong. It was the result of the California chapter concluding that she was telling the truth. If she had been lying, if the investigation had produced a different conclusion, the man who had held a belt around her neck for a 3-hour drive from Nashville to Kentucky would have applied it for longer. That is the specific quality of the Clarksville chapter that the Thomas Chavez episode reveals most clearly. In the calculus they were operating by, the only question was whether someone was guilty. The question of whether guilt would be established through evidence or through the application of violence until someone confessed to something was not a question they were asking. The murder of Stephen Cole. By late 2017, the Clarksville Mongols had been generating federal attention for more than 2 years. The first indictment, charging 5 defendants, had come down in July 2017. Frazier and Santiago had been arrested that same month. The chapter was shrinking under the weight of its own legal exposure, and Jason Meyerholtz, a full-patch Colorado Mongol who had moved to Tennessee for plumbing work and transferred to the Clarksville chapter to help straighten out its internal problems, had observed the dysfunction with the Pern, specific frustration of a man who understood what the club was supposed to be. "My buddies here are messed up," he told agents after his own arrest. "They swap their wives and steal from each other. I should have gone to Mississippi." The final murder began with motorcycles. In March 2017, Stephen Cole had been evicted from a house where William Boylston had been storing motorcycles. During the eviction, the motorcycles disappeared. Boylston blamed Cole. Cole owed him money. Cole wouldn't pay. Cole stopped answering calls and texts. Every time a meeting was arranged for repayment, Cole didn't show up. In the outlaw motorcycle world, this sequence of events carried a specific weight beyond the financial. Boylston was a chapter member. Cole, at this point, still technically in the club, was ignoring him. The chapter had brokered an agreement for repayment, and Cole was disregarding it. If Boylston did nothing, he looked weak. A weak member risked losing his patches. Losing his patches meant losing the identity that the entire enterprise was built around. The pressure to act was organizational as much as it was personal, and the organization had only one language for resolving disputes of this kind. In November 2017, Cole was formally stripped of his membership. Once he was no longer a brother, he no longer had the protection that brotherhood provided. He was now simply a man who owed a Mongol money and had been disrespecting the chapter. The 19th of November 2017, early morning, Jason Meyerholtz and William Boylston went to the house on Delray Drive in Clarksville, where Cole was staying with his girlfriend, Chadley Jewett. William Boylston went to the door first. When he saw Cole inside, both men forced their way in with a firearm. Everyone in the house was told to sit down and be quiet. This was family business. They forced Stephen Cole outside and into Meyerholtz's car. Boylston began beating him in the face in the back seat, demanding to know about the missing motorcycles, the money, the drug use that everyone in the chapter knew was consuming Cole. Cole denied everything. They drove to William Nelper's home in Trenton, Kentucky. Nelper was the chapter's sergeant-at-arms, the officer specifically charged with discipline enforcement, whose home was therefore the appropriate location for what was about to happen. They put Cole in a wooden shed. They zip-tied him to a chair. What followed lasted hours. Federal prosecutors described the injuries found on Cole's body when investigators eventually recovered it: 3 fractured vertebrae in the neck, 5 broken ribs, blunt force trauma to the head, a broken eye socket. The bones told the story of what had been done to him before he was killed. At some point during the interrogation, realizing he might not be leaving the shed alive, Cole asked William Boylston to take care of his son. The request was not honored in any way, the record documents. A 10-inch tent stake was driven through Stephen Cole's head. His body was wrapped in a tarp, placed in the bed of a pickup truck, and driven around for hours while his killers looked for somewhere to bury him. They eventually found an abandoned property on Bend Road in Clarksville. They buried him in a shallow hole behind the house. Christian Dykes, a hangaround who had been recruited to help dispose of the body, was promoted from hangaround to prospect after the murder. His reward for participating in the concealment of a member's killing was advancement toward the patches he had been working for. In the Clarksville Mongols, this was how advancement worked. In September 2018, nearly 10 months after Cole's murder, investigators found his remains. The decomposition was advanced. The injuries that remained visible in the skeletal remains were enough to establish what had been done to him. In a burn pit near the burial site, investigators found remnants of a logging chain, sawzall blades, a tarp, razor blades, and a small sledgehammer, the tools of the cleanup effort that the chapter had mounted after the killing. The federal reckoning. By February 2018, the federal case against the Clarksville Mongols was comprehensive. The ATF, the Clarksville Police Department, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the Kentucky State Police, and multiple county sheriff's departments had spent years building the evidentiary record that a RICO prosecution required, documenting the pattern of criminal activity that transformed individual crimes into an enterprise, establishing the chain of authority that connected orders to acts, and identifying the full membership of an organization that had, in the assessment of the United States Attorney for the Middle District of Tennessee, committed some of the worst organized criminal activity Middle Tennessee had ever seen. The 62-count second superseding indictment charged 19 members and associates with a range of federal offenses: racketeering conspiracy, murder in aid of racketeering, attempted murder, kidnapping, robbery, large-scale drug trafficking, money laundering, witness tampering, and firearms offenses. The breadth of the indictment reflected the breadth of the enterprise, not a single criminal operation, but a sustained pattern of criminal activity across 3 years that touched every category of serious felony available to the breadths. Prosecution. The trial lasted 3.5 months. 6 Clarksville Mongols members were convicted by the jury: James Wesley Frazier, Alex Santiago, Michael Forrester, Jamie Hearn, William Boylston, and Jason Meyerholtz, all on racketeering conspiracy charges, with additional specific counts that reflected their individual conduct within the enterprise. A seventh man, Derek Layton Stanley of Kentucky, was convicted of drug trafficking conspiracy for his role in the methamphetamine distribution network. Others pleaded guilty at various points in the proceedings. The sentences documented the federal government's assessment of each man's role and culpability. James Wesley Frazier, the man who had been at the center of the chapter's most serious violence from its first months, who had participated in the murder of Stephanie Bradley, who had managed the drug distribution operation, who had been the chapter's most consistently dangerous member, received life plus 30 years. Alex Santiago, the man who had founded the chapter, burned the Sin City clubhouses, and participated in the strangling of Sharon Priest, received 40 years. Jamie Hearn, who had helped conceal the Homerson shooting and participated in the abduction of Sharon Priest, received 30 years. William Boylston and Jason Meyerholtz, who had kidnapped and tortured and murdered Stephen Cole, both received life plus 7 years. Jason Meyerholtz, the Colorado transfer, who had come to Tennessee to straighten out the chapter's problems and instead become a murderer, died in custody before his sentencing was completed. Michael Forrester received 17.5 years. Joel Aldridge, the man who had shot Stephanie Bradley in the head at the cemetery in Bumpus Mills, received 25 years. Kyle Heddy received 9 years. James Hines received 10 years and 10 months. The sentencing of James Hines on the 3rd of April, 2024, concluded the prosecution, the last of 18 members and associates to be sentenced. Today's sentence concludes a multi-year, coordinated effort by federal, state, and local law enforcement, our office, and the Justice Department's Criminal Division to address some of the worst organized criminal activity we have seen in Middle Tennessee, said U.S. Attorney Henry Leventis. The language was not hyperbolic. The Clarksville Mongols had, in fewer than 3 years of existence, committed 2 murders, multiple kidnappings, an arson campaign against rival clubs, a drive-by shooting, armed robberies across 2 states, a $1 million methamphetamine distribution operation, witness tampering, obstruction, and the specific category of violence, the beating and murder of a former member that represented the most complete possible demonstration of an organization turning on itself. The 3.5-month trial that ended with 6 convictions was one of the longest and most complex in Middle Tennessee's federal court history. The evidence presented covered 3 years of documented criminal activity, multiple victims, multiple states, and a criminal organization whose conduct had been captured through financial records, physical evidence, surveillance, and the testimony of individuals who had been inside the organization and had eventually decided that cooperation with federal prosecutors was the more survivable option. The ATF's special agent in charge, Mickey French, characterized the verdict in terms that captured what the investigation had been designed to prove. The criminal activities and horrendous acts of violence are dangerous and damaging to everyone involved. The understatement was deliberate. The investigation had produced the evidence. The trial had produced the convictions, and the language of official statements did not need to elaborate on what the jury had already decided. 6 men convicted of racketeering conspiracy, multiple counts of murder in aid of racketeering, a $1 million drug trafficking operation documented and prosecuted to conclusion. What the sentencing produced was a record of the individual contributions to the enterprise's operation. Frazier, life plus 30 years. Santiago, 40 years. Hearn, 30 years. Boylston and Meyerholtz, life plus 7 years each. Forrester, 17.5 years. Aldridge, 25 years. Heddy, 9 years. Hines, 10 years and 10 months. The final sentence, Hines's, was handed down on the 3rd of April, 2024, nearly 9 years after the chapter had committed its first documented act of violence in the spring of 2015. The last member sentenced was the last member standing in the legal process that had consumed all of them. Today's sentence concludes a multi-year, coordinated effort, the U.S. Attorney said. As a result of that outstanding work, our communities are safer and multiple violent criminals are being held to account for their actions. The chapter that had lasted less than 3 years had taken 9 years to fully prosecute. The courts moved at a different pace than the violence, but they got there. What the Clarksville Mongols revealed: the Clarksville chapter of the Mongols Motorcycle Club existed for less than 3 years. It never achieved full chapter status. The P-patch was only removed in July 2016, and by then, the federal investigation was already in motion. It was built by men who understood the outlaw mythology and were genuinely committed to it, who wanted what the patches represented: brotherhood, identity, the specific kind of authority that comes from belonging to an organization that the world takes seriously because it has demonstrated, consistently and violently, that it will hurt people who threaten it. What they built instead was an illustration of what happens when that mythology is pursued without the organizational discipline that the Mongols' structure was theoretically designed to produce. The Mongols' nation had bylaws, commandments, a formal hierarchy, a dues structure, and a process for chapter formation designed to ensure that the men wearing the patches had been evaluated, tested, and found worthy. The Clarksville chapter passed through that process and received the patches. And then they murdered a young mother over a social media post. They buried a former member in a shallow hole after driving a tent stake through his skull. They terrorized their own associates over money that was sitting in a police evidence locker. They promoted a man to prospect for helping conceal a murder. The U.S. attorney called it a reign of terror. That description was accurate in its scope. From March 2015 through February 2018, the Clarksville Mongols terrorized a geography of Tennessee and Kentucky through violence that was not incidental to the organization's existence, but central to it. The violence was how they established territory. The violence was how they proved loyalty. The violence was how they resolved disputes, enforced rules, handled perceived informants, and communicated with everyone around them. When violence becomes the primary operational language of an organization, the question of when to use it and against whom stops being answered with any judgment about whether the consequences of the choice will outweigh the benefits of the message it sends. Stephanie Bradley posted on Facebook about motorcycle guys harassing her. She died in the woods behind a cemetery in Bumpus Mills, Tennessee. Stephen Cole stopped answering texts about motorcycles he allegedly stole. He died with a tent staked through his skull in a shed in Kentucky. Sharon Priest survived because the California Mongols concluded she was telling the truth. She had the specific good fortune of telling a story that, on investigation, proved credible. The margin between her outcome and Stephanie Bradley's was exactly that thin, the difference between a story that held up under scrutiny and one that didn't. The conviction of every member and associate was not simply the product of investigative work, though that work was extensive and coordinated across multiple agencies over multiple years. It was the product of an organization that generated its own evidence through the volume and visibility of its violence, that created its own witnesses through the number of people it threatened, and gave reason to cooperate with prosecutors. And that made itself ultimately impossible to defend, because the pattern documented, corroborated, and overwhelming spoke for itself in a way that no closing argument could overcome. What the Clarksville Mongols revealed, in the end, was not something new about the outlaw motorcycle world. It was something the Mongols' nation's own structure had always been designed, at least in theory, to prevent. The specific danger of giving men who were not ready for it an identity built on the premise that violence was always the appropriate answer, and then watching what they did with it. The Clarksville Mongols wanted to be a chapter. They wanted the patches, the status, the specific kind of identity that the outlaw motorcycle world offered men who were willing to pay its price. They paid it, and in the end, the price was the chapter itself. 2 women, one buried in a cemetery in rural Tennessee, one held at the end of a belt in a Kentucky kitchen. 2 murders, 18 defendants, sentences ranging from time served to life plus 30 years. A chapter that lasted less than 3 years from its first act of violence to its last arrest. The Mongols' nation still has chapters. The red and gold still rides in 28 countries. In Palm Springs, on the 10th of July 2016, men who had burned clubhouses and murdered a mother and were selling $1 million worth of methamphetamine got their patches and were told they were welcome. Less than 2 years later, they were all in federal custody. The patches didn't save them. Nothing could have saved them, because what they built, underneath the mythology and the organizational structure and the commandments and the vests, was not a brotherhood. It was a crime scene, waiting to be documented. Hit the bell and subscribe. There are more stories like this one, coming organizations that thought the structure would hold, that the code would protect them, that the patches meant something more than they did. They didn't.